Hello, students. This is the first time you're hearing from me, and I'm doing an audio file because I personally like them. I like listening to books on audio, podcasts, as I kind of go about my day, my commute. I feel like it's a great way to learn as well as to multitask, or if you can't move your arms, to even read a book on a crowded subway car. So, let's get right to it. I am glad to have you in class and to meet you all. And so for our online component, I wanted to touch base with you and just say I hope that you understand all of the things that we're doing and the way that Professor Haley has explained fashion and art and history, and that you have a really great comprehensive understanding of the past and hopefully how it's intrinsically linked to the present and the future, particularly in fashion, that these things come in cycles and that you are also expected, to have a certain level of understanding when it comes to fashion history, and that when you write about fashion, it's really hard to not reference the past, a past designer's collection, or, a past trend, or properly name silhouettes and things of that nature. So, the best thing that you can really do to learn these things is to read. To read constantly, to read about fashion, read the trade publications like WWD, as well as, the big national newspapers, and even on an international scale, articles that are usually in the newspaper, once or twice a week that relate to fashion. So I mean the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, just having an idea of what's going on, the trends, the way things are marketed, the way that they're talked about. And once you start to build up more of your knowledge and vocabulary, it kind of becomes part of your subconscious as to ways that you can write about these things and do it eloquently and do it in a way that, people feel you are an expert and they, you have authenticity and validity to what you're saying. So it's really important, and it's nothing that you're going to get overnight. It really takes time, unfortunately. So I can't tell you it's like a test that you can cram for and you'll have all the knowledge and then maybe you'll retain some of it. But it's really a process over time. So during your time at LIM, please take every opportunity to use the wonderful Adrian G. Marcuse library and the online resources. You have access to so many databases and free access to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, which otherwise you'd have to pay, at least $100, $150 a year just to have those subscriptions. So it's really a wonderful resource that we're going to be using, and I encourage you to use it, in your free time as well, if you have any. I know it's hard, but if you really love fashion, there's really no way of doing it and not having to write about it at some point. Some sort of communication, a pitch to a new customer or brand via email, or, even your cover letter for applying for jobs. You have to be able to talk eloquently about fashion and, reference things, and it's very important no matter what spectrum of the industry you end up on. So with that being said, I'd like to, just let you know that it's difficult to get there without practicing, doing, the exercises that we're going to be doing, your homework, the readings, all that sort of thing. So let's get started and delve a little bit more into the specifics. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit more about being resourceful, and what that means as a fashion writer, journalist, a publicist, an advertiser, a marketer, anything in the realm of fashion. You're not going to know everyone and know everyone and everything and have contacts there. And the best thing that you need to do is know how to search and connect and network and find the people and the information and the resources that you need. So there's several ways that you can do it. one way is if you work on the PR marketing end, you use kind of these conglomerate, like compilations of contacts called Cision. And so you can search it for people that may fit your specific criteria for something that you need. Another resource is Haro. It's called Help a Reporter Out. And it's kind of like a wire. Like if you're looking for, let's say, a fashion brand that specializes in fitness and even more particular in pants, and even more particular that's located in, let's say, Tennessee, you can put out a request on this Haro, Help a Reporter Out, and get a response from people that, may be able to help to point you in the right direction. So it's kind of like, our discussion thread, for professionals. So it's a very cool resource. Another thing you can do, which don't overlook it, especially if you have a nice number of followers, is social media. Look for brands, especially on Twitter. They seem to respond the most in that capacity. So if you're trying to find a contact, let's say at Donna Karan, you could go to the Donna Karan website, find, their social handles, their official approved social handles, go to Twitter, and, at them, your request. And so most likely, especially the bigger companies and brands, have people that are on the customer service end that are monitoring these accounts, and they will get back to you relatively quickly. So it's a great way to kind of get contact information. Another resource that you can use, which I actually love and I think is kind of a hidden gem, so let's keep it between us, but it's called Modem Online. And so you can search for contacts in fashion, art, design here in New York, but also worldwide. It's a really lovely compilation. And so you can also search for contacts at brands specifically, as well as at showrooms and publicists. And it's created for more of a fashion week target, but obviously these brands you can use beyond the fashion week scope. So it's a really lovely resource to have. And then, worst case scenario, you can use things that are a little bit more public, like LinkedIn or the contact form on a brand's page, which you may or may not get a swift response. It really does depend. So there's different things that you can do to kind of find fashion-related resources. And, we have Google, so utilize it, but also think about the kinds of keywords that you may need to search that are general and specific to get you to a contact that you need for a piece. So, for example, let's say I'm doing a piece on Dior, and I need to find a Dior contact in the U.S., so how might I go about doing that or searching for that on Google? Any ideas? Well, one thing that you can do is you can think about what kind of information may have been put out there by a publicist, a PR firm, marketing for Dior in the U.S. One main item would be a press release. So you can search Dior U.S. press contact press release. Another option might be, have they had an event or a new store opening? You can search for that information, and most likely you'll find some sort of email information, RSVP information, something of that nature. If you're trying to get a contact at a magazine, how can you go about doing that? Well, I'll tell you. So for starters, you can use a site that, are for journalists, magazines, publications like Media Bistro, which is a tremendous resource. If you're serious about being a writer, I definitely recommend it being one of your main places that you go. But they have a certain amount of content that you can access for free, and others you might need a subscription to. I think the membership might be like $85 a year or something like that. But you can get a lot of information from them, and you can search, and they have mastheads, which is that page in a magazine that has everybody's name who has worked on the magazine, works for the magazine, listed. And so let's say you need to find who the accessories market editor is at Marie Claire magazine. Well, you can look it up in the masthead, and then you have her name or his name, and then let's say you need to get their email. Well, for a lot of the bigger magazines especially, the email address is always very, very formatted. So if you find one person's email address, granted, you just pick up and drop that formula and you can use it for everybody else. So for example, if it's firstname.lastname@condenast.com, then you know that your contact, if that magazine is under the conglomerate of Condé Nast or Hearst or whatever it may be, it will be the exact same formula. So it's really just using a tiny bit of logic, a tiny bit of, thinking about the information that you need and how it may be presented, searching for it, and 9 times out of 10, you're going to find it. Or going to find some sort of clue to it, and you just have to apply it to exactly what you need. So those are a few quick and easy little tips that should be able to help you find some information. Because starting out, you may not have a wealth of contacts, a virtual Rolodex that you can kind of search through, and you'll have to build it yourself. So it's a good way to think about. Professor Haley really emphasizes the importance of understanding, the fashion history aspects, art, film, all these things. So in addition to being resourceful, you also want to make yourself knowledgeable and aware of the things that touch on fashion that are going on in these environments. And so being in New York City, LIM College is a great resource for you. And just keeping your eyes and ears open to what is going on will help you to have a deeper, more meaningful understanding of these things and different ways that the information is presented to you. So for example, we talked about so far different ways of being resourceful, but you have to really expand your knowledge yourself. So if this is really what you're interested in fashion, you should want to be taking advantage of every opportunity presented to you in which you can further explore and expand your knowledge of the category. So one of the main things that you can do, which should be very, very important, is to see museum exhibits that are related to fashion. Here in New York City alone, there is no less than 2 or 3 fashion-related exhibits going on at the same time. So we have the museum at FIT, which has a minimum of 2 exhibits going on at all time. And the best part about it, it's free. It's free for everybody all the time. Every single day that they are open, you can go in and you can see free museum exhibits that are fashion-related. How amazing is that? And they change them out really frequently. So you could be seeing probably 6 to 8 free fashion exhibits a year just from FIT alone. The Brooklyn Museum of Art has really stepped up their fashion game. They now have probably 2 or 3 fashion exhibits a year that are always very cool, draw a great crowd. Guess what? Once a month, they have free Friday night, so you should hit that up. The Met Museum, same deal. They have usually a big master exhibit in the Costume Institute, which was recently redone. But they also have other museum exhibits in different galleries that always touch on fashion. So it might be something exactly up Professor Haley's alley, like fashion and art. And so it'll be in a different gallery with a slightly different spin on it, but it's always a good way to think about different interpretation and different ways to approach fashion and make it more of an interdisciplinary approach. And by that I mean combining different elements, of art, film, fashion that can go together. So it's very important. So the Met, and also with the Met, it's pay what you wish. So you could literally give them $1 and go in and see an exhibit and spend all day there. It's pretty awesome. There are smaller museums throughout the city that also have fashion-related exhibits. So it's really just a matter of keeping your eyes and ears open, reading the paper, listening to, what's happening, talking to people. If you, love it, you'll find it, and you'll find it everywhere. In every museum, every, exhibition will be different. It'll be a different curator, a different approach, a different voice, a different lens of seeing these things. And you can't help but, adapt to that and think about how you could possibly communicate that in your writing. If you were to write something about a museum exhibit, what would you say? How would you say it? What are the important details? What are the things that you go to the exhibit and you see that may necessarily not be on the radar? So, for example, if you go to see a museum exhibit at FIT, one thing that you might want to pay attention to is all of the little periphery items that may be considered the backdrop. So these little things that may be kind of, present, but not necessarily in the foreground. It's not the clothing or accessories or the, center of the exhibit themselves. For example, the types of mannequins that are used. Why do they use these particular mannequins? The positioning of the mannequins. Why are some facing, toward you, angled, facing the back, clustered together, separate? What's the meaning of all that? What is the layout of it itself? So the way that the curator wants you to kind of move through the exhibit. Why might that be so? Looking at the backdrop is very important. So usually these exhibits will have some sort of tapestry or information or magazines or photos or something from the era they can relate. So it's important to always pause and look at that information. And most clothing, items do have a plaque with them that explains the context of the garment, and gives the facts about it. So, the date, who donated it, the fabrication, all that stuff. Stop and read it. It is important. It's there for a reason. It brings the experience full circle. So don't miss out on taking a look at that. Other, ways that you can present and see these things, are important. And the context in which they're presented is not something to dismiss. So make sure to always give light to that. Another great museum that I almost forgot, I can't believe it, is the Museum of Art and Design. They always have very cool things that are in relation largely to jewelry and accessories, but also to other larger scale kinds of things that relate to fashion. And they do that a few times a year as well. One thing that they did recently was they had an exhibit on Pucci, the art of mannequins. So Pucci is one of the biggest companies, most renowned companies for making mannequins in the U.S., and it's still situated in Chelsea, which is pretty cool that it's a New York local company. And so it's something that you don't necessarily think about is the mannequin and how the mannequin itself can be such an incredible piece of art. The way that it's crafted, the way that it's, designed in its place, in a store, in a museum, wherever it may be. So it's really important, to break down and think about all these little tiny elements that can possibly go into, fashion, its display, and that these are decisions that have all been thought out and orchestrated. It's nothing that has been done on a whim. So even looking at something like a mannequin is very important. The next thing that I would like to discuss within the realm of other venues and, other mediums that you can look for fashion related information and resources is, of course, film. So in recent years, there's been an increased interest in this genre, and it's mainly in documentaries. So it's designers, interesting, people, fashion icons, socialites, celebrities, editors. These are the kind of people that really have been drawing a high level of interest lately, that, have become big documentaries that have, sometimes shown nationwide, at all of the major movie theaters like AMC, Regal, United Artists, etc. Some of them are smaller independent theaters like the Angelica or Sunshine, or Lincoln Center Cinemas. So you have to seek them out, and it's a little bit more of a task to go see them. But I will tell you that they're almost always worth it to check out. There's going to be something that inspires you or enlightens you or makes you have a euphoric moment that you can think about and write about. And every time you see, a fashion-related film, it's good to think about from a critic standpoint, what worked, what didn't work, what's the backstory on this person or this documentary, even the documentarian, him or herself, what's their relationship to the subject, and what kind of review you would give it. So as you're kind of watching along, it's good to kind of start to formulate your opinion and your voice. Especially, if it's something that you're enjoying, how would you share and reiterate this information? Because part of fashion writing really, really revolves around the review. So it's something that's relatively unavoidable that at some point you'll have to be doing some sort of review of something. A product, a collection, a museum exhibit, a press release. It's all some sort of review of something. And so what makes yours different than others is your writing level, your writing style and voice. And, not to beat a dead horse, but your expertise, your background, your understanding of what you saw or read or watched, and, how you can put that into the context of fashion history and what's happening in contemporary fashion news. So it's all good stuff to keep in mind and think about. So as of recently, there's some of the more recent documentaries that I think are really interesting, have been Iris, which is Iris Apfel, who for many, many decades ran a textiles company, a worldwide textiles company with her husband. She is a New Yorker through and through, and the Met actually did an exhibit on her several years ago because she collects a lot of cool pieces of costume jewelry and clothing from her travels. So very unique individual style. Great character of a person, and just really interesting to kind of see. Another one is The Eye Has to Travel on Diana Vreeland, who was a very famous editor of, most famously, Vogue magazine. And so there's other documentaries of, like American Blogger, which to me isn't really my favorite, but it's interesting to see through another person's eyes, how the blogger industry is really growing and is becoming somewhat of a movement, I guess you can say. I don't want to say a trend, but perhaps it is a trend, and how nationwide, worldwide, it's been embraced, and how different people kind of approach it and interpret it, and what they do, how they create their blogs, and the type of content they have, and stuff like that. So it's pretty interesting, to think about how one person would have interpreted interviewing people and talking about being a blogger and blogging. So something to pay attention to. So in addition to new movies coming out, one place that always seems to show them is the Film Forum in Soho. So, keep an eye on that theater for movies that are coming out, documentaries, films, and chances are there'll be a fashion one in the mix. So another resource for you is, of course, looking at them through YouTube, because some of these things get uploaded, as well as online. So I found there was like a very short documentary on Karl Lagerfeld and Fendi done at the beginning of their collection. I think it was like spring, summer 2015 maybe, and it's called like Enter the Mothership. But it was a very short thing, maybe like 11, 12 minutes long, and it all was free to watch on YouTube. And it gave you a little capsule into what it's like to get ready for a collection at Fendi. So it was pretty cool. Another resource that has a lot of stuff online and for free is IFC. And so they have documentaries on designers, same kind of thing, like getting ready for Fashion Week. They have like the day before, and that they profile different designers. So that could be a really cool resource for you to check out for films. Also, if you have a Netflix membership, a lot of these films are on Netflix. You can search fashion, and Hulu is another awesome resource as well if you have that. HBO to go, all these online services in which you can stream. Amazon Prime, you can watch movies. You're bound to find some fashion options in the mix. Another cool thing to think about is the fashion show itself. That there are places like Show Studio, occasionally on Vogue.com or Style.com, where you can watch, or on the brand's website, that you can watch a show in its entirety. So it's kind of cool to do that, and it's a great practice to get in for when hopefully you're at an actual real show, that you can think about what to expect, the order of things, how to kind of process it, and that kind of thing, so that you can do it in real life when you're at an actual show. So that can be something that you can definitely do to check it out. Speaking of actual shows, if you attend or not, in the run of show, which is, I would say, at least 90% of the shows provide them. It's a little 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, usually just, 1 or 2 pages, that has the inspiration for the collection, all of the looks listed with their descriptions, and then kind of like a credits page of, who did the music, the hair and makeup, the styling, all that stuff, which is a pretty important piece of information. But if you've gone to a show or not, usually if you read a review on WWD or Vogue.com, they'll have all this information as part of their review. So something that you can do is to kind of look at that information and see what was the designer's inspiration. Was it a place? Was it an era? Was it a movie? And if it's something that you can look up, which pretty much everything you can these days, do it. So let's say that the latest Naeem Khan runway show was inspired by Morocco in the 1970s. You can Google Morocco 1970s, Morocco, glamorous Morocco 1970s, Yves Saint Laurent and Morocco 1970s, all these different references, and kind of get a feel for what he might have been inspired by, and then look at the collection and see in your mind if you feel like you see a correlation. I've noticed that it's weird that in one season some designers will reference the same movie, and it won't necessarily be a contemporary movie. It might be a movie from like decades and decades ago. So if you see that popping up, if let's say Monique Lhuillier was inspired by Breakfast Club or some sort of movie, from decades ago, go see if you can watch that movie. Might be a cool introduction, to some inspiration and a different way to kind of think about things when viewing the collection. So there's all these little things that if you are curious about fashion, you can explore them and learn even more than you ever anticipated. So now I'd like to transition to the subject of this particular lecture, which I've dubbed Fashion Culture and Its Explorations. And so we're rethinking history a little bit, thinking about macro and micro ways to approach it, and different ways to write about it, of course. So, as I mentioned before, you guys saw Professor Haley's wonderful videos that give you a really colorful layout of fashion history as we know it. So, now that you know the facts, you can decide how to add another interesting layer to think about them. Because, let's face it, no one wants to read anything that just sounds like you're writing a paper. In a paper, you're used to basically reiterating the facts in your own voice, adding in a bit of your opinion, which, it's okay. But in this class, we're going to do a little bit of that in the beginning, but we're going to move away from that so that you can continue to work it on your own writing style and developing it and trying it out for different mediums. So newspapers, magazines, online. So we're going to, that's what you're most comfortable with and you're used to doing from, years and years of school. And it takes a while to kind of break out of that a little bit and to adapt to new ways in which you can write. So it's scary at first, and it's hard to know what your writing voice is and develop it, and also have the skills to kind of go along with it as far as, technical, grammatical, perfection to a certain extent, or knowing how to edit yourself and correct these things. So let's talk a bit about adding in that extra element that makes your pieces that you write so much more interesting. And, one thing that we need to do is to bring into the discussion a little bit of theory that is, social theory, bigger, larger themes that work across a lot of categories that you can think about and apply. So in addition to, stating the facts, let's say Yves Saint Laurent was super big in the 70s, and, he kind of brought in this element of androgyny and power. Okay, let's go there. Let's explore that a bit more. So some of the larger themes that you might want to think about when writing about fashion are things that can, touch on the more maybe sentimental aspects of it, and kind of the bigger picture ideas. So I really like to look to Linda Grant and Rebecca Arnold for some of my sources in, inspiration in this area. And so I'll be referencing them a little bit over the next, half an hour or so in this lecture. But some of the larger themes overall can relate heavily to identity and transformation when it comes to dressing. So within that, we have, these ideas of confidence, power, positivity, nostalgia, embarrassment, memory, relationships of all sorts, love relationships, family relationships, social class relationships. Clothing is armor. Clothing is protection. Clothing and aesthetics is priceless and also having worth. So all these different things, are some themes that you might want to explore, and here's a little kind of quick snapshot of them. So just to give you a little bit more about that, I'm scrolling through my notes that I wrote that I want to talk to you guys about. So in a book about clothes, do you have to have images? Yay, nay, it helps, it doesn't matter. Sometimes, we live in such a visual culture and society that we rely heavily on the image. But sometimes it's nice to take a step back and do the reading, listen to the words, work on your writing and your descriptive capabilities, really making a robust attempt at using different adjectives, and to let that be your only way of talking about these kind of things before relying on plopping in an image. I think it's a great technique for your writing, as well as formulating your opinion and your own visual about these things. So think about those themes. What comes to mind when you think about fashion and you think about power? Do you think about Daphne Guinness kind of adorning herself heavily with all kinds of metal clothing and jewelry and elaborate, ostentatious things of that nature? Or do you think about power? Do you think about 80s power dressing, where women, wore shoulder pads that were, very exaggerating of the shape. And there's a theory that the more your body takes up, the more space your clothing takes up, the more space, in general that you take up, lends a hand to you being more powerful, having more of a presence. So this is something that goes back hundreds of years, even, to the Renaissance age of thinking about the more fabric used, the more, indicating wealth. So what do these terms mean to you? When you think about dressing in power, what does that mean? When you think about dressing in identity, what does that mean? Do you think in terms of gender? Or genderless, unisex, androgyny? Do you think about yourself and what it means for you and how you form your identity through dress? Every day we make conscious and subconscious decisions, toward the items that we select in our wardrobe, the items that we buy to get dressed. So how does this impact you? Have you ever really thought about it? Maybe if you looked at your shoes, at your clothing, and kind of tried to catalog them into what aspect of your identity, of who you are, does that fit into? Is it giving a true image, or is it giving a projected image, an aspiration of who you want to be? It's interesting to think about. It's not something that you would do on the regular, so it's good to take pause and kind of assess what you have in your wardrobe and what it kind of means to you. What comes to mind when you think about clothing and nostalgia? Clothing and sentimentality. Is it a ring that your grandmother may have given you? Is it, a clothing item that you bought with your best friend when you were a senior in high school and you had a great time that day? What is it about nostalgia that, ties us and links us to these kinds of items? How might we be able to translate that into writing? How might we be able to translate that into society? What might society be nostalgic about when it comes to fashion? Certain looks, certain trends, a certain beloved celebrity that, kind of popularized that trend. What could it be? So that also ties into memory. What do we know about fashion and memory? There's also some fashion theory that, you have to be a certain number of years away from a trend, an era, before it becomes, charming and pleasing to the eye again. If it's too close to the reference point, it just seems frivolous and silly. So for us right now, that might be clothes in like the late 90s, early 2000s. But it seems like 80s and 90s, especially early 90s, is far enough away, 20 years away, that it's cool again to reference. So let's think about, too, the society aspects of it all. What makes clothing fit in society and a social, particular social strata? So I'm sure that you guys in some of your other classes have learned about some of the fashion cycles, as far as the trickle-up theory, the trickle-down theory. So basically styles and trends, for the trickle-down theory, starting kind of in the upper class and making their way down eventually to the masses, or the opposite, starting, in the streets, street culture, youth culture, and making its way up. So a chunk of what Professor Haley talked about in the, second half of the fashion history lecture was just that, was kind of the youth beat, especially in the 60s, the 50s, what was kind of popularized by the younger generation, the baby boomer generation, kind of making its way up. So it's interesting, it doesn't have to mean that a whole year, decade, or era is epitomized by that. But it's cool to kind of think about if you can pinpoint where a trend, may have started or may be able to give it some sort of origin. She talked about Mary Quant and how Mary didn't necessarily create mini skirts, but she saw what was happening and she, just made it her own and sold it, and it did really well, and then she was attributed with creating the mini skirt. So sometimes it's a little bit more complicated than a straightforward answer, but still it's good to try to find the root of these things and find definitely validity in that. So continuing on, if you're looking at a trend that in particular is definitely a revival, I was just talking about pieces from the 80s or, the early 90s. What might it be about now that may make them popular again? What is it about this year that makes it feel like it's the right time to start wearing crop tops again? What might be the indicators of that? And some of it is as simple as, one big designer showed something on the runway, like several years ago when Celine did like furry Birkenstocks. And sometimes it takes a while for things to really rapidly catch on to the masses again. But now this past summer, I can't go anywhere without seeing multiple pairs of Birkenstocks on everybody. So that's a very clear indicator, that a reason why something's on the rise, because it was just so different and shocking than everything else that we were seeing on the runway, especially within the context, that they were worn with it. You normally would see, a really cool pair of heels or something instead, but it just kind of felt so off-kilter and ugly, but cool within that, and the cool validity that Celine did it. So that must mean that it's very cool. Things like that, which is lucky if you can find them because they're more straightforward, or is it something a little bit more subtle if you kind of analyze, silhouettes and hemlines. So one way to think about that is that, for a while, the pant waistline has been relatively low, and now it's been definitely. So the pant line was low, and now it's been creeping up higher and higher and higher to more of a higher waisted look, kind of 70s. And with that means that the shoe silhouette will probably change, and the top silhouette will likely change. And so as the pant, silhouette is the pant hemline, waistline creeps up, tops probably are not going to stay at the same length, and they're probably going to start to recede as well and get higher. So just by looking at that, it can mean an understanding of why crop tops might be popular. So, you have to think about what affects what. Especially when it comes to silhouettes, like what makes sense, what looks good together, and why it's happening. And you need to think of language that can describe it that's more than factual and fragmented sentences. It's very important. And so think about these things, and look and see if you can find any reference point for them. So another overarching element that I'd like you to think about in your writing is the fact that we don't need to buy clothing all the time. We don't need fashion. We desire it. We, create a false sense of need for it. But at the end of the day, there's something that is drawing us to it and giving, a reason, creating a rationale as to why we have to have it, why we have to buy it. So when you talk about clothing and different things, you need to give a little bit more than just, this is what the clothing was, this is why it's cool. There needs to be more of a context to it, so part of that is understanding consumer behavior and marketing and, the underlying human nature to to acquire, to consume, and what is kind of drawing us to those things. There's a lot of research and theory that has been done in this area. And, to go back to referencing Rebecca Arnold, she states that seduction sells clothing. Now, do you agree or not? Do you find that to be true or not? She says, to continue, that consumerism is far more than just economic activity. It is also about dreams and consolation, communication and confrontations, image and identity. So this idea, of image and identity, again, surfacing and thinking about aspects of status, power, and display, how we present ourselves to others, what we, are communicated to them, what draws us to certain looks, to purchase, to then have our personas projected through these looks. And so time and time again, depending on what side of the spectrum you're on, marketing goes back to the idea that sex sells, that seduction sells. So there is going to be sensual and sexual elements to fashion and clothing, and it's up to you to decide, how you're going to approach that and what elements you're seeing that may convey that or not. But there is no doubt that, there is an underlying element that's driving sales, the reason why people are buying. And I think that, you need to break that down a little bit more as to what is so enticing about a particular piece of clothing, a particular collection. On what level is it resonating with people or not, based on aesthetics and a little bit more. So delving a little bit more into that, think about, what kind of status different items might portray. Items like fur. Obviously, it has a utilitarian, standpoint that, it keeps you warm and stuff. But what kind of status does that retain? What does it, project to people who see it? What about the idea of excess? We're living in a culture in which you can have anything pretty much whenever you want it. Fast fashion reigns from Forever 21 to Zara. You can have, runway-like looks immediately. And these shops, these companies churn out more and more looks. So that's another approach that you can take is, kind of fashion has become more democratic in that everyone can have looks, that are like the runway looks, but for a lot less and pretty rapidly too. So, thinking about that element too, does that cut down on the aesthetic of having runway stuff? Does that mean that the people who adopted the runway trends early on will then reject them once those looks are available to the masses? Because that's generally what happens as part of the fashion cycle. However, in this day and age, things are moving so rapidly that there's not that much time between those things. And sometimes the cheaper brands are knocking off the looks before, the runway, the luxury company can even manufacture them and get them in the stores. So it's an interesting phenomenon that, the quick dissemination of information via the internet has kind of fueled to a certain extent. We talked about, some other elements that you may want to explain in clothing through Professor Haley talking about popular looks in the 80s with like Armani and Miami Vice. So that concept of Armaniism, which is a controlled ethos and broken down simplicity, is something that you can bring to your fashion writing. Also, the need for control or letting go of control through clothing is another theme that you can explore. And so think about what these various things may mean to you, and as you look at different pieces, different collections, think about if they epitomize, looks of power, status, simplicity, control, armor, protection. Another way to think about your fashion writing and looking more in depth at the details in the underlying elements opposed to the facts are, what makes a garment truly covetable. So if we take luxury, for example, what would be the difference between, a crew neck wool sweater by, let's say, I don't know, Armani, versus one that you can get at Old Navy or Uniqlo? They're both navy wool crew neck sweaters. They're pretty identical. But what might make one more of a luxury item than another? So there's all these little elements that you need to think about, like what kind of wool is it? Where was it made? Was it made here? Was it made in China? Was it made in Bangladesh? Was it made in Italy? Where is the country of origin, and what kind of prestige or not is associated with that? What kind of stitching is it? Does it seem like it's well made? Does it seem like there's loose threads? Are there any kind of subtle detailing that can be appreciated? That with a consumer that is knowledgeable knows that each, sweater by Armani or item by Armani has a tag on it that has a special number, so each one is unique, something like that. Or that the insides, of the sweater, the cuff sleeves can be rolled up and they show a different color or a little accent or a logo or something that's very subtle but is Armani. So what are these little different things that distance one product from the other when it may be, virtually identifiable as the same? So there's another element to think about in your writing, is that how can you share and convey, distinct qualities of a product, a trend, a brand. So another way to think about further enhancing your fashion writing and looking a little bit more closely at the underworkings of what's going on are two things. One are groupings, that may be subculture related that you can plop a certain style or designer into. So for example, if it feels like something is punk or something is grunge, those are kind of obvious cliches that you can put, with a certain designer, a collection, or a review. But then again, you have to think about, how is it different? How is it being brought into the 21st century and made contemporary or anew? How is it like and how is it unlike punk or grunge or whatever the reference is? So some things, too, are looking at themes that are, kind of might be strong but not as obvious. So some things to pay attention to are what might be the collection signature or the designer signature that you can identify that is a certain theme that can carry through season after season. So we know that Alexander McQueen had a very strong theme of Memento Mori. So what is Memento Mori? Does it sound like anything you know? Does it sound familiar? Have you never heard this before? It's a very popular theme, actually, as of late, or I should say the past few years, but it's kind of the remembrance of death, the, significance of death, and just kind of the reverie of it, but a reminder of, our humanity. And so this was a very big theme that McQueen kind of always worked into his season after season, the idea of kind of death and decay. And you can see it, in some of his very beautiful garments, the way that he interpreted it, but also in some of the very, very popular garments that propelled the trend of like the skull scarf and things like that. That those are more commercialized versions of it. So to think about themes like that, and also other themes that designers may work in that may be a little bit more subtle Themes of unisex or androgyny, kind of thinking about the difference between gender and what, it means for something to be androgynous versus unisex. Any ideas? Any thoughts? Well, I can tell you that, it wasn't always a popular theme, and that it had been tried by other designers, such as YSL. Yves Saint Laurent had tried it in the 70s, but it really wasn't the quite time and place. So the context of these things and when they kind of arise and are embraced, it has a lot to do with timing, and it can be luck and coincidence that it becomes popular. So unisex, according to Arnold, seeks to mask the body in supposedly genderless clothes, while androgyny seeks to unify masculine and feminine in one body. So can you feel a bit of the difference between the two? So I think that, thinking about androgyny, there's been a lot of trending of, women traditionally feminine and masculine silhouettes that have been merging and being worn by both genders. And you're still, identified as feminine or masculine, but there are elements, of both being found. Can you think of other designers that may be marketing themselves or embracing a signature that relates to androgyny? Perhaps take a look at some of the most recent collections. I know there's a few New York designers, young up-and-coming New York designers that kind of fill that section of the market. And so it's quite interesting to kind of look and interpret, how the clothing is marketed and portrayed. So continuing on, I would like to think a little bit more about these larger themes. Exaggerated looks, and think about a little bit how you can include them in your writing. So we've got the facts, we've got the nice layer now of going into a little bit depth with these larger themes, such as identity, power, transformation, androgyny. And then we've got the last element is you seaming them together and writing about them. So what is the best way that you can start your writing? If you're doing a review, let's say, you can set up your article so that you have a nice order of progression of things. And so, again, emphasizing reading, I think a good thing that you can do is look at style.com or WWD and see the routine, the habitual way that these kind of reviews are set up and spoken about. So let's start with a great example. What I'm going to do is read you from WWD a review of the Stephen Allen Men's Ready to Wear Spring 2016 collection, a review by Jean E. Palmieri in WWD, and it was just published a few weeks ago, so we're in August of 2015. And so here we go. Stephen Allen Men's Ready to Wear Spring 2016. In a time when normcore is the new normal, Stephen Allen is incorporating more conceptual ideas into his basics-driven collection. The concept for spring came from space, an idea that was evident in the all-white, layered look with a banded collar shirt and cotton linen poplin that was reminiscent of astronaut wear, as well as a button-down shirt with a celestial star pattern. Apart from these out-of-this-world elements, the rest of the collection was solid and centered around a clean assortment of blazers, t-shirts, polos, and Allen's trademark fitted shirts. "It's like your dad's shirt, but in smaller proportions," Allen said. Another surprise came from the use of Japanese fabrics, a big trend this season, which he used in ultra-thin chambray shirts and light wash jeans. Based on the number of collaborations Allen engages in every season, Vans and Common Project sneakers for fall, for example. It appears as if others in the fashion industry also believe in his down-to-earth aesthetic. So, let's review this review. So, what do we have working here? We have a setup that references contemporary culture and trends, what's going on. So we have normcore in the beginning, and then in the end we have another trend reference when it talks specifically about the fabrication, which is Japanese. So we kind of have it anchored by two trends kind of happening, and then in the middle we have a backdrop story of what Stephen Allen is doing this season and what he's known for. So they use the word trademark, his trademark shirts, and they have a quote from him talking about how they're distinct from other shirts that are similar. And then, we also talk about the context of what Allen is kind of doing and how he might be part of what's happening now in fashion, and how he's important as part of the industry, and kind of the bigger picture of that at the very end of the piece. So it's very subtle, it's very quick, it's under probably 200 words, but it gets everything that you need to know about Stephen Allen, his recent collection, what's happening in fashion, a little bit of a reference to a past, and moving forward. So it's a really great example of a review that, can be typical of the direction that you may want to mimic a fashion show review off of. So today I've left you with a little bit more understanding, hopefully, of the realm of resources that you can use and think about. And obviously this isn't an exhaustive list. There's a lot more to explore and to think about. Just to recap, we've also talked a little bit about some other themes, some more obvious and others more subtle, that can surface, in fashion writing that you may want to consider, explore, and look for. And last, I left you with the taste for what we're going forward with when it comes to writing and reviews. So next time we're going to talk more specifically about writing for the fashion environment. And so I hope that you found this interesting, and I'm going to leave you with a quote for now from Linda Grant, who it's from a book called The Thoughtful Dresser, and she says that the concept of clothes is the only thing that is a constant that one can truly rely upon, and that you need to think about clothing as text, clothing as narration, and clothing as a story. So what story in this class are you going to tell? What story are you going to narrate? How are you going to do it? The easiest way really is to think about yourself and your own story, your own relationship with clothing. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you guys soon. Professor DiNardo signing out.